Welcome to this program. Today I will be delivering an important lecture of this course, British Colonialism of Subcontinent, Impact on Culture, Economy and Polity. The main objectives of this lecture are to understand the concept of colonialism and its onslaught in the subcontinent, to study British colonialism and its impact on the economy in subcontinent, to study the impact of British colonialism on politics in subcontinent, to study its impact on the culture, and at last to understand the resentment shown by the people against the change brought up by the British colonial state. Dear students, let's understand first the concept of colonialism. Colonialism is a form of domination, the control by individuals or groups over the territory or behavior of other individuals or groups. Colonialism is associated with the power hierarchy between the rulers and the ruled. So, it refers to the intergroup domination in a culturally heterogeneous society. Tony Smith, in his work on the patterns of imperialism, points out that colonialism has to do with the domination by a strong state over a weaker people, and it does not control the same way as home population. By this general definition and assumption, colonialism began sometime around 1500 and lasted until about 1950s, when most, but not all, of the colonial territories were granted or gained political independence. The political map of the world changed dramatically between 17th and 19th century with the onslaught of colonization by the European powers of the distant lands in the East. It was during the 16th century that English merchants became increasingly interested in the possibility of capturing the spice trade in Indian Ocean, which the Dutch and the Portuguese companies were finding very profitable. With the grant of royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I, the East India Company received the monopoly on all trade east of Cape of Good Hope for about 15 years. Afterwards, the profits made by East India Company from its economic operations in Bengal financed to a great extent the wars that British waged across India in the period of their colonial expansion. It became the rulers of Bengal in 1757, and with further expansion by the end of 18th century, it was in effect a shadow of British Empire. The later half of 18th century saw English East India Company emerging as victorious commercial military power in Bengal after its victories at the Battle of Plassey and Buxar. The remaining decades of 18th century and early 19th century witnessed the slow and halting transformation of British Company from traders to rulers. This shift necessitated the establishment of institutional infrastructure and a definite policy perspective for governing the subject population. The British colonialism had an impact on economy, polity and culture of the subcontinent. Dear students, let's have a look as how the British colonialism changed the local economy, polity and culture in the subcontinent. Impact on the economy. The economic policies followed by British led to rapid transformation in India's economy into a colonial economy whose nature and structure were determined by needs of the British economy. In this respect, British conquest of India differed from all previous foreign conquests. Previous conquerors had overthrown India's political powers but had made no basic change in country's economic structure. Moreover, the British colonial state never became an integral part of Indian life. They always remained as foreigners in the land, exploiting Indian resources and carrying away India's wealth as a tribute. There was a sudden and quick collapse of urban handicraft industry, which had for centuries made India's name byword in the markets of entire civilized world. This collapse was caused largely by the competition with cheaper imported machine-made goods from the Britain. After taking the strong position in many places, the British imposed a policy of one-way free trade in India after 1813. It was immediately followed by the invasion of British manufacturers, in particular cotton textiles. Indian goods made with primitive techniques could not compete with goods produced on mass scale by powerful steam-operated machines. The ruin of Indian industries, particularly rural artisan industries, proceeded even more rapidly once the railways were built. The railways enabled British manufacturers to reach and uproot the traditional industries in the remotest villages of the country. As the American writer D.H. Buchanan has put it, I quote, "The armor of the isolated, self-sufficient village was pierced by the steel rail, and its lifeblood ebbed away." The cotton weaving and spinning industries were the worst hit. Silk and woolen textiles fared no better, and similar fate overtook the iron, pottery, glass, paper, metals, guns, shipping and dyeing industries. Apart from influx of goods, some other factors arising from British conquest also contributed to the ruin of Indian industries. For example, the oppression practiced by East India Company and its servants on the craftsmen of Bengal during the second half of 18th century, forcing them to sell their goods below the market price and to hire their services below the prevailing wage, compelled a large number of them to abandon their ancestral professions. The high import duties and other restrictions imposed on the import of Indian goods into Britain and Europe during 18th and 19th centuries, combined with the development of manufacturing industries in Britain, led to virtual closing of European markets to Indian manufacturers after 1820. The gradual disappearance of Indian rulers and their courts, who were the main customers of handicrafts produced, also gave a big blow to these industries. The ruin of Indian handicrafts were reflected in the ruin of towns and cities which were famous for their manufacture. Cities which had withstood the ravages of war and plunder failed to survive the British conquest. For instance, famous cities of the town such as Dhaka, Surat, Murshidabad and many other populous and flourishing industrial centers were depopulated and laid waste. The tragedy was heightened by the fact that the decay of traditional industries was not accompanied by the growth of modern machine industries, as was the case in the Britain and other Western European countries. Consequently, the ruined handicraftsmen and artisans failed to find an alternative employment. Moreover, the British rule also upset the balance of economic life in the villages. The gradual destruction of rural crafts broke up the union between agriculture and domestic industry in the countryside and thus contributed to the destruction of self-sufficient rural economy. On the one hand, millions of peasants who had supplemented their income by part-time spinning and weaving now had to rely overwhelmingly on cultivation. On the other, millions of rural artisans lost their traditional livelihood and became agricultural laborers or petty tenants holding tiny plots. They added to the general pressure on the land. Thus, British conquest led to deindustrialization of the country and increased dependence of the people on agriculture. No figures for the earlier period are available, but according to the census reports between 1901 and 1941, alone the percentage of population dependent on agriculture increased from 63.7% to 70%. This increasing pressure on agriculture was one of the major causes of the extreme poverty in India under British rule. In fact, India now became an agricultural colony of manufacturing Britain, which needed it as the source of raw materials for its industries. This process was very well termed by great freedom fighter of India, Dadabhai Naoroji, as the drainage of wealth. The economic policy of the British had devastating impact on peasants also, who were progressively impoverished under the British rule. In the very beginning of the British rule in Bengal, the policy of Clive and Warren Hastings of extracting largest possible land revenue had led to such devastation. On the fate of poor peasants, even Cornwallis complained that 1/3 of Bengal had been transformed into a jungle inhabited only by wild beasts. In the both permanently and temporarily settled zamindari areas, the lot of peasants remained unpleasant. Peasants were left to the mercies of zamindars, who raised rents to unbearable limits, compelled them to pay illegal dues, and perform forced labor or beggar, and oppressed them in diverse other ways. The conditions of cultivators in Ratwari or Mahalwari areas was no better. Here, the government took the place of zamindars and levied excessive land revenue, which was in the beginning fixed as high as 1/3 to 1/2 of the produce. The harmful effects of an excessive land revenue demand were further heightened by the rigid manner of its collection. Land revenue had to be paid promptly on the fixed dates, even if the harvest had been below normal or had failed completely. But in bad years, the peasant found it difficult to meet the revenue demanded, even he had been able to do so in good years. The British devoted almost entire income to meeting the needs of British Indian administration, making the payments of direct and indirect tribute to England and serving the interests of British trade and industry. Even the maintenance of law and order tended to benefit the merchant and the moneylender rather than a peasant. A major characteristic of British rule in India and the net result of British economic policies was the prevalence of extreme poverty among its people. While historians disagree on the question whether India was getting poorer or not under the British rule, there is no disagreement on the fact that throughout the period of British rule, most Indians always lived on the verge of the starvation. The poverty of people found its culmination in a series of famines which ravaged all parts of India in the second half of 19th century. The first of these famines occurred in western Uttar Pradesh in 1860-61 and cost over 2 lakh lives. In 1865-66, a famine engulfed Orissa, Bengal, Bihar and Madras and took a toll of nearly 20 lakh lives. Orissa alone losing 10 lakh people. Apart from these major famines, many other local famines and scarcities occurred. William Digby, a British writer, has calculated that in all over 2,88,25,000 people died during famines from 1854 to 1901. Another famine in 1943 carried away nearly 3 million people in Bengal. These famines and the high losses of life caused by them indicate the extent to which poverty and starvation had taken roots in India. Now let's have a look on the impact on the polity. The British colonization has an impact on various aspects of politics in India. One of the obvious effects of British colonization was realized by the decline of the system of old regime. The political universe for former chiefs and little kings which survived British pacification were severely altered as imperial consolidation took place. The former chiefs and little kings no longer were the center of the system of political and religious ideas, where they had shared ruling status and ruling authority with the gods and goddesses which ruled the universe. In pre-colonial India, there had been no civil society, no large social sphere of human interaction which was separate from the state. All institutions of rule, from the village level up, were loosely linked in the ritual networks which focused on sharing of authority between ruling men and divinities. Political and religious rituals in villages and ideas of authority were modeled more or less on the rituals of royal courts and great temples. With the consolidation of the colonial regime, there was a political revolution when one considers the fate of the ideological structure of old regime. What was left of networks of ritual and patronage became wrapped. The colonial state took the monopoly of force and assumed responsibility for the management of major conflicts. The former ruling elites lost their status as the protectors of the communities. Former ruling families tried to maintain what they could of their former status and honor, building palatial mansions and spending lavishly. They continued to engage in conflict over succession to ruling titles and honor, but these conflicts were managed in colonial court of law and not the battlefield. In the course of 19th century, Indian ideologies of rule, monarchical cosmologies became fragmented. No integrated system of Indian political ideology survived the political disruption of colonial rule. Nationalist leaders at the end of 19th century would not look to Indian kingly traditions but to Western models of liberal democracy as they thought about the future of Indian nation. Under the colonial rule, the colonial system of centralized dispute management became a major arena for social and political ranking. The Anglo-Indian legal system was devised formally for the protection of property. In India, issues of control of property were also importantly issues of status and honor. As former ruling families engaged in conflict with temples lost their political significance and became defined more narrowly as religious institutions. As royal kin went to court over succession to titles and honor, they became redefined as the social, not the ruling class, the native aristocracy. Of wide significance was the new relationship between the structures of kin, clans and lineages and subcastes and the state. Under the colonial state, kinship was no longer a major element in the formal constitution of the state. Relations to kin were no longer a legitimate basis for the organization of the state. The imperial government was to be run according to regulations and laws that would be universally applied. In the areas of commerce and criminality, much of the law in the Anglo-Indian legal system came from Britain. For non-commercial, non-criminal conflicts involving property, the colonial state had special legal categories, importantly, Hindu personal law and the Muslim personal law. The colonial state tended not to see its subjects as members of lineages and clans in competition for honor, authority and command, but first as two big block constituencies, Hindus and Muslims. Furthermore, affairs of kin became depoliticized as personal and private matters, not political or public. The Hindu bloc in particular became further conceptualized as consisting of castes whose affairs should be properly educated according to law codes based on classical Brahmanical law. In the last half of 19th century in Punjab, however, the government of the province decided on less rigid policy and tried to apply customary law. Through the application of Hindu personal law in the course of 19th century, those families who could afford to use colonial legal system became the agents for social values, which were heavily influenced by Brahmanical ideas of caste and status. The Varna system became more universally and rigidly applied, and ideas of caste became more fixed. The adoption of Brahmanical customs, Sanskritization, became more common. Towards the end of 19th century, caste associations emerged with the aim of mobilizing people with same caste designation to join together to standardize their customs, adopt higher status customs and to protect their interests vis-a-vis other castes. Caste identities became universalized. We can talk then about 19th century as a period of Brahman Raj as well as the British Raj. In the course of this social change, Brahmanical values of womanhood became more widespread, making divorce unacceptable and promoting wifely devotion to her husband as her god. Woman lost political significance in the 19th century as kinship became depoliticized. The long-term result of this remolding by legal process was the organization of Indians around the religious identities. With the gradual universalization of caste identities, Indian society under the colonial regime became more both rigid and fragmented. The language of the courts served to mark the colonial state off as different in culture from Indian society. Especially in urban areas, the state emerged in Indian consciousness as different from the society. Large areas of what had been traditional political practice in India, giving gifts, supporting kinship for positions, became seen as illegitimate politically. The cultural and political divide between colonial officials and Indians grew wider, and colonial officials became increasingly convinced of their duties as the only possible legitimate rulers of India. One important effect of this cultural and political divide between colonial officials and their subjects was the emergence of civic arenas, a public sphere in major urban centers in British India. Civic arenas were those activities where elite urban men met and discussed issues of common public interest. These men included traders, merchants, and those who had the resources to acquire Western English language education. The emergence of civic arenas and the nature of discourse in public sphere differed from region to region. Public sphere activities occurred sooner with more radical results in Bengal than they did in Bombay Presidency or Madras. Madras was the area of slowest political change. At last, let's see the impact of British colonization on the culture. Indian society underwent many changes after the British came to India. In the 19th century, certain social practices like female infanticide, child marriage, sati, polygamy, and a rigid caste system became more prevalent. The British took a keen interest in introducing English language in India. They had many reasons for doing so. Educating Indians in the English language was part of their strategy. The Indians would be ready to take work as clerks on the low wage, while for the same work the British would be demanding higher wages. Wherein Hastings, the first Governor General of India, was in favor of creating an English bureaucracy which would be well versed in Indian language and responsible to Indian traditions. In 1784, Hastings noted that every accumulation of knowledge, and especially such as is obtained by social communication with people over whom we exercise dominion, founded on the right of conquest, is useful to the state. It is the gain of humanity. The cultural and social policy during Hastings' governor generalship has often been explained as one of the inspired by the ideology of British Orientalism. It must be kept in mind that this ideology also fitted in with the requirements and limits of British Empire in India. Knowledge about the subject population, their social customs, manners, codes were essential prerequisites for developing permanent institutions of rule in India. For Hastings, the mastery over traditional Indian language provided the key to understanding India and communicating with the subject population. Civil servants were encouraged to learn Persian and Hindustani before coming to India. Since the company took official action on the issues of language training only as late as 1790, Hastings, as an immediate solution, gathered around himself a group of civil servants who were dedicated to the study and translation of Indian texts on law and jurisprudence. To encourage such activity, Hastings offered attractive financial inducements for translation exercises. Apart from language, let's see its impact on social customs. The first traditional social custom which was suppressed by Indian government was the practice of infanticide. Female infanticide was prevalent in many parts of India. The difficulty and expenses incurred in marrying girls among us the Rajputs, the Jats, the Mewars and Rajput Rajkumars of the Banaras gave rise to the practice of killing female infants by starvation or poisoning. Jonathan Duncan, the resident of Banaras, was the first official who tried to curb this social evil. Instead of unilaterally abolishing infanticide by legislation. The next significant state intervention in the Indian social life was the suppression of widow burning or sati. This practice was widespread in all three presidencies at the beginning of 19th century, with a larger number of reported incidents being in the lower districts of Bengal. No sustained and systematic efforts were made to suppress this inhuman practice till 19th century. While other European companies in Bengal had banned widow burning in their territories, the Calcutta Supreme Court disallowed it only in one part of the state. The government's early attitude towards this practice can be seen when in 1789 Broke, the collector of Shahabad, disallowed an act of sati. Referring the case of Governor General Cornwallis, he noted, "The rites and superstitions of Hindu religion should be allowed with the most unqualified tolerance, but a practice at which human nature shudders cannot permit without a particular instruction." Cornwallis replied asking him not to employ coercive method and try and persuade the people to stop this practice. In 1797, the Midnapur district magistrate who stopped the burning of child widow was asked by the Governor General to avoid coercion and use persuasion. While the government deterred over this issue, the westernized Bengali intelligentsia led by Ram Mohan Roy actively agitated for the abolition of sati. In 1818, he sent a petition to the government urging them to abolish this practice and counter orthodox Hindu demands against prohibition. The conscious attempts at the state intervention in India's social practices and customs were extremely limited in their impact. However, the colonial government, by altering the political configuration of pre-colonial India, did trigger of significant structural and social change. The British consciously denied political power and privileges to pre-colonial ruling Indian groups while recognizing their social and caste status. The small Western educated Bengali intelligentsia engaged in debates with the state on policy matters, responded to the policy change and independently tried to bring about social change, for example in Bengal. This group of intelligentsia, which included personalities like Ram Mohan Roy and Keshav Chandra Sen, were impressed by the British progress and convinced that Indian society needed an urgent social change. At the same time, they resisted Anglicization as well as Christian missionary attempts to convert Indians. Intellectuals like Ram Mohan Roy offered to their countrymen a reformed Indian religion, Vedantism, free of superstition and priesthood. As far as the imposition of English language by British is concerned, the Western thinkers like Max Muller and Anne Besant encouraged vernacular language and literary works to instill a sense of pride in Indian heritage and culture. It enabled Indians to revive India's cultural past. It may therefore be reiterated that the pragmatic considerations of British Indian government acted as a strong check to translation of reformist ideas into state policies in India. Social and religious institutions were an area in which government intervened with great caution. Dear students, I hope that you have understood this lecture on the impact of British colonization in India and its culture, polity and economy. Thank you.